Welcome to The Deep End by On Deck, a podcast where visionary builders, creators, and experts discuss world-changing ideas. I'm your host, Marshall Kozloff. Let's dive in.
In a worst case scenario, there'll be a lot to learn. Let's put it that way. But in the best case scenario, we've created something truly special. And at the end of the day, would be a mission-oriented city where people feel a connection to the city and a sense of pride, a sense of ownership. Like, this is my city. I believe in the mission. I believe in the values. And the city is living those values like no other city. So when I said the most transparent, the most fair, the most connected, people will see it come to life. It's not just words spoken, but actually lived by the people.
At The Deep End, we're creating a space where we skip the surface level and go in depth into ideas that matter. I'll be your guide as we explore possible futures of commerce, higher education, art, governance, longevity, and more. Joining me in The Deep End is Marc Lore. Marc is a serial entrepreneur and self-described moonshot seeker. He has successfully founded and sold 3 companies, including Jet.com, which sold to Walmart in 2016 for $3.3 billion. Now, he's partnering with baseball legend Alex Rodriguez to launch a venture capital firm and tackle big ideas. Today's conversation is about how to build a future city that is equitable, fair, and connected. Most moonshots set their sights for the stars. Marc's is a little different. It's rooted here among Earth's metropolises, which is why Marc has decided to devote his life to reimagining urban life on our home planet. Part of this reimagination centers on what Marc calls equitism. This is the idea that the city of the future should figure out how to create an equitable and sustainable future for its citizens first, and only then erect buildings, seed its first 50,000 residents, or even buy a sports team. He plans to call this metropolis Telosa, which comes from an Aristotle-coined word telos, meaning a higher purpose. Because if its organizers nail its values first, then its infrastructure can be then designed accordingly. You can learn more about the project at cityoftelosa.com. That's cityoftelosa.com. Marc's vision for building a values-driven city of the future is comprehensive, and we discussed fresh ideas about everything from land ownership to underground garbage systems to a network of electric air vehicles and water recycling. In a time when we hear a lot about the progress divide in the world of bits and the world of atoms, this discussion with Marc was an exhilarating peek into how the world of tomorrow might one day look. The Deep End is produced by On Deck, where top talent goes to accelerate their ideas and careers. We hope that those who listen to the ideas on the show are inspired to build. To learn more about On Deck's programs, visit beyonddeck.com. For show notes and additional resources related to The Deep End, check out ideas.beyonddeck.com. All right, let's dive in. Marc Lore, welcome to The Deep End.
Hey, Marshall. Great to be here.
It's a really auspicious time to talk about a big, ambitious project because you're taking a bit of a different direction than most folks are seeing in the news right now. The hot thing, obviously, is space, but the project you're focusing on, a city, is noticeably ground bound. So I just want to start here. You've said that this project of building a city over decades with billions of dollars of capital is actually the thing for you in terms of your life's work. Why are you so focused on the Earth when so many folks are focused on the outer bounds of space?
Sure. I mean, I could certainly see the interest in space. It's the next frontier. But I think there's so much that could be done here on Earth. And I don't think we've nailed the perfect model for society. And I think we should be testing new models. We're certainly going to test one, but I'd like to see others step up as well to test new models. You know, we've been on this earth a relatively short period of time, and we've made a lot of material progress, but I think there's more to be done and more to learn. And I think there's an opportunity to create a higher quality of life, just trying it a different way. That's all.
Something that's interesting here, you just referred to a society, and we're talking obviously about building a city. Is there a difference between a city and a society as you're thinking about the vision and the model here?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when people often talk about a city and you hear so many people and groups out there building cities. A lot of cities have been built. And for the most part, they start as sort of a real estate project. Like we're going to get land and put up buildings and shopping centers and things. We're approaching it a little bit differently, where the city is really just a tactic to help test a hypothesis we have on a different model for society. So, the mission is to create a more equitable and sustainable future. That's it, full stop. And we've got a set of values, and we're sort of starting and coming and approaching it from a values orientation. So the three values are fairness, transparency, and connection. And the intention is to be the most fair, the most transparent, the most connected city in the world, and serve as a model for others to learn from. The inspiration for this new city and sort of this new model was really a function of thinking about capitalism as we know it today. And there's so many great things about capitalism that we love, and there's some things that are a byproduct that aren't great. The income and wealth inequality is a result of capitalism as we know it today. And I was doing some research and sort of inspired by this book I came across, Progress and Poverty by Henry George, late 19th century economist, that basically proved in this book, and I found it very compelling, that the problem that we face is one that will continue. That in spite of all this material progress, there's always a class of workers that are just barely sustaining life. And it'll always be that way as long as there's landowners that basically control what is, a very scarce resource and are able to extract profit up until the point that people are just barely getting by. And that's sort of the way it's sort of set up. And I thought, really the land appreciation, especially from the early days when lands were virtually worthless to land being worth something, like when you actually got a city, the land appreciation is caused by primarily two things, and both, come back to people. One is just the fact that people move there and build communities, and other people then want to join those communities and live in those locations. And two, tax dollars of the citizens go into investing in infrastructure to support the city, roads, bridges, tunnels, subway systems, things like that, which increases the value of the land. And it just seems to me that the fair way to do it would be if all this land appreciation going from sort of zero to when you have a city, that land appreciation is caused by the people, that the people should benefit, the citizens should benefit from that appreciation to come back to the citizens. And so what we're testing is this concept of taking land that's virtually worthless out in the desert, let's say Nevada, have a private foundation buy this land. If we can get and build a city of, let's say, 5 million people, that land will be worth, call it $1 trillion in round numbers, at which point the foundation would start selling the land off and diversifying and create an endowment, a diversified $1 trillion endowment, that it would earn, call it $50 to $60 billion a year. And it would use that $50 to $60 billion a year it earns off this endowment to give back to the citizens in the form of enhanced social services. So think the most incredible, education, healthcare, affordable housing. Those are probably the big three. And if you infused 50 to 60 billion a year into a city over and above what you would typically get from a city from tax dollars, that you could have the most incredible services available to any citizens around the world. It would probably be comparable, if not better, than what you'd find in sort of more socialist type economies. But the great thing is you'd be not funding it with increasing tax dollars. You'd be funding it through this private foundation, which simply benefited from and saw the appreciation of the land caused by the people and gave it back to the people. So I do think this is an interesting potential solve where it's still, capitalism it's capitalism at its best. It's sort of a slight modification. We're calling this new system equitism because we believe it's more equitable, and we're basically just giving back the appreciation of land back to the people because they caused the appreciation in the first place. And if this works the way we think it could work, and trust was built around this private endowment, that potentially citizens would donate to the endowment as they do universities today. Nobody donates to their city to make the city better. That's called taxes. People avoid paying taxes, but yet they donate to universities, they donate to museums, hospitals, because there's trust there. They know that good will come from it. Well, if the endowment proves being transparent and does good and people believe it, they will, in fact, hopefully donate, which would be a virtuous cycle, reinforcing cycle of more and more dollars going into the foundation having more money, being able to do more for the citizens. And so with each generation, quality of life would continue to improve. That's sort of the big vision here. But, if we're all going to build a city from scratch, yes, we want to prove this model, but at the same time, we could also take learnings from what works and doesn't work from cities around the world and apply them to this new city. So how do you make the city safer, more efficient? Is it only autonomous vehicles? If that's the case, you don't need street lights, you don't need street signs. You can have the roads be more narrow, a lot more walkability, bikeability, mobility could be enhanced. It could be completely self-sustaining from an energy perspective, especially in Nevada with solar energy. How do we make use of eVTOLs at this time, to make mobility faster and more efficient? Do we move garbage and services underground to keep things cleaner, to keep things more efficient? Like, these are some of the problems that we're working through right now. And I suspect that in a worst case scenario, there'll be a lot to learn. Let's put it that way. But in the best case scenario, we've created something truly special. And at the end of the day, would be a mission-oriented city where people feel a connection to the city and a sense of pride, a sense of ownership. Like, this is my city. I believe in the mission. I believe in the values. And the city is living those values like no other city. So when I said the most transparent, the most fair, the most connected, people will see it come to life. It's not just words, spoken, but actually these words will be lived by the people and by the city itself. And one of the things, we're going through an exercise now of trying to identify exactly what people think is not fair about their cities, what's not transparent, and what makes them not feel connected, to basically try and reverse those things. And what was interesting is, and probably not surprising, but around fairness, the number one thing so far that's come out that people said is unfair about cities is the fact that local taxes fund local education. That seems to be about the most unfair thing across the board as we're going through this exercise. The fact that the poorest neighborhoods get the worst education by definition because they've got the lowest amount of real estate tax revenue to fund the schools. That just seems unfair. It's certainly not sort of what the founding fathers of America intended, I don't think. And so that'll be one of the first things that we change in this city, for example, to show how we're living this value of being the fairest city anywhere in the world. Oh, sorry, I can go on and on, Marc.
No. This is
ask questions here.
Well, it's funny because my next immediate question in the script is going to be, hey, just lay out your vision, and you literally just did that. So I'm just going to ask a bunch of questions I was writing down, and we can just kind of go down the list. So the immediate thing that comes to mind, given your point about fairness and property taxes and education, is I'm curious to the degree to which the objective here is to demonstrate a model for building new cities versus offering lessons for existing cities. So for example, if you're looking at a city where there are poorer parts of towns that don't have access to the same amount of capital, taxes, et cetera, there's a bunch of spillover effects that come from that. If you're starting a city from scratch, by definition, you're not going to have gentrification, right? By the nature of what you're doing, it's not possible. You are not going to have a part of town that was maybe redlined due to racism. So I'm curious, as you're looking at that property tax issue, how do you think of when you're starting something new? How do you, I don't want to say replicate the existing problem that cities are looking at, but how do you just balance the fact that you just aren't going to have that issue of a poorer part of town that's been unfairly treated over a 200-year period?
Yeah, I can't say that this is necessarily going to fix all the problems in existing cities, not by a long shot. I think if we're able, though, to show people a new path It's basically, we're going to have a set of metrics that determine whether or not we're being successful here. We haven't got down to exactly what they are, but we're going to be very focused and maniacal about tracking these metrics. So quality of life, happiness. Do people feel that the city is fair? That they're treated, they're respected? Do they feel that it's inclusive? And really score ourselves and compare ourselves to other cities. And if we can show that, yes, in fact, this city is more fair, more transparent, more connected, more inclusive, people feel happier, a higher quality of life, healthier, better educated. Like these are all, there's no reason why we couldn't actually, based on what we talked about and having all this capital to invest in these services, there's no reason why we couldn't be number one and number two sort of across the board on those metrics. And if we prove that, I think people won't be able to not sort of focus on what there is to learn. And each city will learn something different. And it's hard to say what they'll learn, but when you have something that's working, it just gives people ammunition everywhere around the world to say, yeah, but look at Telosa. And by the way, the name of the city is, I didn't say this, but the name of the city is Telosa. And Telos, it's a word from history. Aristotle coined it. It basically means a higher purpose. And I think we really just fell in love with that, because at the end of the day, we are building the city for a much higher purpose than simply building a city, it be a real estate project. It's got a much broader, bigger mission. So we really fell in love with the name Telosa. Yeah, I think there are cities around the world, if this works, will learn different things from Telosa. They'll have their own takeaways. But I think it can serve as a model and show what happens when you bring all these things together at once. Sometimes it's hard to do something on a one-off basis because you do something and then it has repercussions somewhere else. Like if you need to fund education more, you're pulling money away from something else, and there's always a give and a take. We're basically having our cake and eating it too, because we're able to, with low taxes, be able to create enormous wealth and incredible social services because of this idea that we're capturing this initial wealth appreciation of land from zero to, being a 5 million person city. And that's really unique. And no one's going to be able to replicate that. But I think there's probably new cities that will be able to use this model if it works. And old cities will try different things, maybe, even if they try things, right? As a result, I think it would be a huge win.
Something I'm wondering about, I listened to your episode with Sam Parr on the My First Million podcast, and you had a bit of a discussion about bootstrapping versus heavily capitalized moonshots. And I want to take that discussion you're having and put it into the context of this piece. So, for example, you're from New York City. I'm in New York right now. New York is the definition of a bootstrap city. It evolves over 400 years. There was a Dutch dude didn't sit down in the 1600s and say, you know what, we're going to build the financial capital of the world. It just happened. So in the terms of identifying this plan, and I'm not saying a plan in the Soviet sense, you have an objective, you're broad, you're obviously being very metrics based. How do you think of the idea of a city organically evolving versus trying to say, no, look, we have these priorities, let's evolve that over a 3-4 decade period?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, it will be decades, if not hundreds of years, for it to come to fruition completely. This is not a planned city in the sense that we know how it's all going to play out. It's not a private city. It's going to be a city like just any other city in America. I think what we can do is set the foundation in the same way that the founding fathers did in America. There was sort of a constitution and a foundation, and then it sort of organically grew from there. And that's what we're trying to do, is put the right principles in place early, the right building blocks, and then let it organically grow. Plant a seed and let it grow. And so I think a big part of it is, like I said, is getting the mission and values straight day one, and really living those values in a way that people can connect to the city and be emotionally connected and feel a sense of pride. And then to see the city with the first 50,000 residents, I think is important, because in order to create a diverse, inclusive city, you're going to need to have people from all walks of life, race, religion, different income levels, different age, different professions, interests, things that it really needs to be a diverse group. And the hope is that if you seed it with a really diverse group, that it'll continue to grow organically in a diverse way. I think without that, and there's arguments that people could argue both sides. I think if you let it just day one be organic without seeding it, there could be a certain group that it really resonates with. Maybe it's, wealthy, certain type of people or whatever. And I think it's hard to then go from something that's very homogeneous to something that's diverse. So seeding it with diversity day one, I think is going to be important. We're imagining that the first 50,000 is sort of built like a university class in some ways, where you're sort of making sure that you've got representation across all different types of people. I don't know if 50,000 is the right number. I think we still need to talk to more sort of experts in this field that could help us, think about what's the right number of people to then kick off the right cycle of organic growth. And I think it's a combination of that, the seeding combined with the set of values and, just the way the city's built, just being more efficient, more safe, more sustainable, environmentally friendly, more walkable. There's a lot of things that we'll implement from scratch, not because we've done it better than anyone else, but just because we do have a clean slate. And there's been so many learnings and there's so many things that cities know today, but just have a hard time implementing. Like if you wanted to go and reduce the size of roads and go to autonomous vehicles, that'd be really tough to do in an existing city. But if you built a city from scratch and the roads were lined in a way that made it very easy for autonomous vehicles to exist, and you didn't have cars, but they were only autonomous, then you wouldn't need things like street signs. You wouldn't need lights. The roads could be really narrow. The cars could be inches apart, and because there'd be less accidents. It'd be safer. There'd be less noise, no honking horns and things like. That's something that's easy to do from scratch, but very hard to do in an existing city. Although if cities see it done and working, they can then retrofit and say, okay, we see it working. There's no risk on whether or not it works. We just need to go from where we are to there. I think sometimes, even though people could simulate it, and it's very hard and risky to be the first city to just take that leap, and just go do it.
I'm bringing this up not to nitpick because that'd be honestly incredibly boring, but I'm just trying to think about this from the process that you're going through, because we're hitting this in the intro, of course, but you're obviously a person who's grown companies across pretty much every conceivable scale here. How do you separate the vision that you have here from actual practice? So the example I'm thinking of is the comment you made about streetlights. And when I was back in the University of Oregon, something that was really important was women on campus actually really liked lit streets because that made them feel safer, especially at night, given those dynamics. So it's interesting how we're talking here. There's this obvious vision that makes a lot of sense of autonomous vehicles, yet there are all these little things that come up. So as you're just thinking through this process, let's not focus too much on the streetlight example, because this is the idea of it. How do you think of the broad vision you hold? And then look at how something is supposed to organically evolve when there are 50,000, let's say with this number you started with, different cogs and functions that are coming in there?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, that's a really complicated question. It's something that is going to take years to fully flush out. I think we're starting to talk to experts in every field. A lot of great people in the field of academics that have studied this for decades, different aspects of it. I think at the end of the day, it's sort of painting the big vision for what we're trying to do, landing on a set of values that we live by, and then finding the very best people in the world to help us think through these issues. And there's always trade-offs. And so we will have to take a point of view at some point. There's a trade-off having autonomous only vehicles versus having a hybrid cars and autonomous. There's a trade-off there, and why one or the other. And people will criticize us probably on either direction, but it'll be like sort of the holistic vision that we're solving for. So if safety, which it definitely is, one of the cornerstone of people having a higher quality of life and being happy, if safety is really important, then you may lean in one direction over another. You may, like you said, have the streets very well lit. Autonomous vehicles are much safer than cars. If quality of life was tied to how clean the city is, the cleaner the city, the better people felt about their living environment. That's the reason to move garbage underground and not above ground. There's you have to solve for something, and there's always trade-offs. And the only way to get to the right answer, or again, it may not even be the right answer, but an answer, is to surround yourself with a diverse group of the smartest people in the space. It's not about ego. It's not about control. We need to really listen and be open to hearing people that have thought about these issues for decades, and listen to those people and bring them around the table. And so this is what I always talk about with startups. It's the VCP framework: vision, capital, people. We're setting the vision. We're gonna raise the necessary capital to pull this off. But at the end of the day, it always comes down to the people, the execution. And if you look at any city that's been built, successful or not, in most cases, you could point to the people that were the driving factor in either case, whether it was or wasn't successful. Cities that have been built that are just sort of empty, ghost towns. There's no soul, there's no culture. The city didn't stand for anything. There was no reason to move there, no emotional connection. And that's one of the things good entrepreneurs do really well, is they know how to create a culture. They know how to create a place that people want to come and work and give the best they've got. And so it's a similar type of approach that we're looking for here.
I'm going to keep citing My First Million, the podcast you did, because it was a really great interview. And you spoke a lot at the start about your process for recruiting folks and interviews and reference checks. So speaking of the people part of VCP, how do you think about actually recruiting and finding those folks in a new category like this? So I'm imagining a dream team of sorts, maybe a Mayor Suarez type from Miami who can just meme the city into existence, maybe a Robert Moses who, problematic 1950s, 1960s things aside, has a real vision and abilities to operate and get things done. How do you think about finding those folks over the course of this period, especially, for example, because this is so much at the vision stage? This is probably not quite the stage that folks like that are quite as interested in it. So how do you just think about this process over time?
Yeah, I mean, just like I would in any startup, basically talking to a lot of people. So you starts off with a small network of people. Hey, here are the areas of focus right now of interest. Do you know anyone in these areas? And what you find is the world is actually pretty small. When you talk to well-connected individuals, they all seem to know someone that's really well-connected in at least one of the areas. And then from that seed, you basically open up into a whole new group of recommendations, and just keep talking to people that have been recommended, and you very quickly get to the handful of experts in the field. But it does take persistence and really pushing people to think about who they might recommend, and having the meetings and taking every meeting and talking to everyone and learning, not at all ever thinking like, people aren't worth your time. Everybody's worth your time, and you could learn something from everyone. And eventually you'll find that person that sort of like believes in the vision, shares the passion, and is willing to like put real time into it. And it just naturally happens that way. It's the people basically show themselves to you. If you speak to enough people, they will show themselves to you.
You know what's interesting? I'm going back to your comment about culture and community and not just having empty ghost cities. Obviously, you are involved with the Minnesota Timberwolves, with A-Rod. I'm curious, is the second thing you're going to do try to bring a sports team in? Not talking NBA level, but I'm just trying to think of things you could do to actually differentiate from a McMansiony suburb where there's nothing actually going on. How do you think of actually forming something together from a unified perspective?
Yeah, no, that's great. So we've partnered with Big, which is a world-renowned architecture firm from Denmark. BRK is the founder of that, and he's been very involved in the project here. And we're really going through the process of designing what the city might look like, keeping in mind that it will organically grow after we sort of seed it, but still thinking through where might a stadium be, football or baseball or basketball, hockey, like these different sports and cultural centers and museums, and what are sort of those big iconic structures that a city of 5 million people would want to have. So while we won't, sort of get involved in sort of who moves or lives in the city beyond, the initial seed, and certainly there'll be lots of different developers and architects and real estate people involved, there will be a need to with certain iconic places and things, that to be kind of thought out a little bit in advance. Now, we're not going to have a football team or a baseball team or basketball team, in the first few years when there's 50 or 100,000 people there. But thinking how the city evolves from 50,000 to 500,000 to 5 million, and when does it make sense to do that is something we're thinking through. Not just in sports, but in all those areas.
Something I'm curious about, because we're focused a lot on the vision level of happiness, fulfillment, those parts. Let's put aside the metrics for a quick second. I'm going to just ask you on a more personal level how you think about this. How do you think people go about determining whether they enjoy the situation they're living in? I'm asking this because the past year and a half of COVID has forced people to think very deeply about, do I like this lifestyle? Do I like where I'm living? I went from someone who was living a very urban DC lifestyle to loving the suburbs because I had space to walk around even during lockdowns. So within that context, how do you just personally think about your environment and how you enjoy that environment, how other people are thinking about that?
Yeah, so we did go through an exercise, and I wish I had the exact stats in front of me here, but it was all the things that you would think of if you sat down with a group of friends and brainstormed things you like about a city and don't like about a city. That's what we did. We went through the same exercise with just maybe a little bit broader group. And I think what people love about cities, like a city like New York City, where I am right now, they'll tell you they love the culture, the fact that there's access to sports and arts and a long tail of possible things and experiences. Because the population is so dense, you could have some of those long tail, really super interesting things that you can have access to in a smaller city. The diversity. People love that. The vibrancy, the fact that, you can go to a bar within walking distance of just about anywhere, after midnight. It's not like some of the cities that are too small. You just don't have the density. Places close early, like that kind of like lively action. People love that. People don't like it's not as safe sometimes. It is noisy. It is dense. And so it's not as many parks. It's not as much nature. The public transportation may not be as efficient as you'd like it. So we're kind of looking at all these different things and saying, hey, if we're doing this from scratch, safe, less noisy, more walkable, better and more efficient transportation, more parks, like we could actually solve all those things pretty easily. And there have been cities that actually have been able to do that. But what they lose is the vibrancy and the culture and the density. How do you actually combine both? How do you actually have all those things I just said and have the density of population to allow you to have a really vibrant, diverse culture? And that's sort of the challenge. And that's what we're sort of working through now. And I think what's really interesting is there are some technologies, I guess, that can be applied to a city today from scratch that make both those things possible. So I'll give you two examples. One, we came across this public transportation system out of Israel called Skytrans. And it's basically almost like, if you think a little bit like a high-speed monorail system where the monorail is only big enough to have and fit a family. And if you can imagine these pods traveling at 60 miles an hour on the outskirts of the city. And when you come to your individual stop, the pod basically pulls down and lets you out. You never have to, like in a subway system or in a bus, stop at other people's stops. You basically zip around at 60 miles an hour and pull off when you get to your location. that enables the city to be and feel much more dense, even though you have more square acres per person, right? Like you could have more area, but because the Skytrans is so fast to move you from one place to another, that it could actually feel like it's got a lot more density because you could just cover a lot more ground. So imagine in Manhattan, if you had the Skytrans going around the outside of Manhattan, you can go from all the way downtown to all the way uptown in less than 10 minutes, where now it could take an hour, like as an example. So if people downtown can be uptown in 10 minutes and uptown could be downtown in 10 minutes, think about how much more density you get effectively. You could actually expand the city, have more space and more land, and at the same time, still have anything that requires density, people would be able to get there just as efficiently, even though if they're further away. That's one. The second thing is eVTOLs, these electric vertical and takeoff and landing aircraft that will probably be flying within 3 to 4 years. Okay. And if you can imagine the suburbs right now, you want to commute into New York City from 30 miles out in New Jersey, it's going to take you, hour and 15 minutes to go 30 miles, maybe an hour and a half. With an eVTOL, you can cover that same ground in 20 minutes. So that allows the same thing. It allows you to expand the suburbs even further and have more land, but at the same time, still have the same number of people coming into the center of the city to have that density that's required to have those long tail services. So you can have the best of both worlds, more land and the same density. So that's like one of those nuances that we're working through that becomes a really fun, challenging project, as we think through it. But that's just one example of kind of like how we're thinking about things.
I think the quick comment is, I just moved to New York, and the part that was referenced in a piece about your work is that garbage stored underground. I'm very not a fan of trash on the side of the sidewalk. So I think that's my personal contribution that I will add to your list of things here. So no, but something I'm curious about is, let's talk about the sustainability side. So, I'm from the Western United States, so I know that an issue in states like Nevada is, water rights and water access. And if you're talking about going from 50,000 to 5 million, just anything within that range, that immediately becomes a concern. So I understand that from an energy usage perspective, there are issues and things that can resolve itself. But how do you think about water, specifically in these empty spaces that haven't been settled for a reason?
That is the single biggest challenge of being in that area. And I think there are a lot of things to learn. We're talking to some of the worldwide experts in water rights and water in general. One of the things that we're going to have to be best in class at is, how we recycle water. And we think there's opportunities with the latest technology to basically, do a lot more with less water. So that's like the starting point, is like, for a population of 5 million people, if we could use the same amount of water with 5 million people that other cities need with 1 million, and we think that's possible, then obviously that's a huge advantage. And secondly, it's going to be expensive to get water in. But at the same time, like in the desert of Nevada, sun and solar power becomes very cheap. And so there's that trade-off. Water is really expensive, energy's cheap. And we've kind of, back in the envelope, mapped it out, and we feel really good that we can make the math work. So, but again, we're still early stages. And so with every passing month, we learn more, but we're at that stage now where we've sort of convinced ourselves that it's doable. It's just, we don't have the precise numbers yet.
Something, Rui, have you ever come across the writing or work of a guy named Balaji Srinivasan? He was at A16Z, was at Coinbase.
Haven't talked to the person, no.
He's very notable for having a lot of thoughts about startup cities. And just as a method of doing this, he's very much from the post-seasteading space there, but also bringing in the venture Coinbase A16Z side. But basically, his idea is that given the vision-oriented nature of the communities we're discussing here, and he talked about this on our first episode, what folks should do is they should build their communities online before they actually build them in person. So I'm curious what you just think about that idea. So if you're saying we're looking for folks who are diverse, who are interested in a different model, who are somewhat pioneering and experiential, how do you think about forming a community online first, then translating into the real world, rather than doing it the traditional method of building a community, laying down the flag, laying down a stake and building from there. I'm just curious how you think about a scenario like that as I'm throwing it at you.
Yeah, I'm very open to it. We're talking to various folks that have actually recommended that same thing. But yeah, it's too early to know exactly how we're going to approach that. But certainly open to it and think it's fascinating concept.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I think as we're nearing the end here, something I'm just actually curious about, because I also listened to the episode you did of Harry Stebbings at 20 VC. You very specifically mentioned that during your days over the past 20 years, you basically haven't had that much time to read. And you started this episode by talking about like a deep and very important book that helps shape your thinking around this. So I'm actually just curious. You're obviously very, very thoughtful, and this is a big, complicated thing. How are you just going through the thought process of coming to this? Because I don't imagine myself being as busy as you are, and then just thinking about cities on the side. So just can you talk us through the process, right, that took you to this point?
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons why I don't read is I think it takes time away from thinking. So I spent a lot of time thinking. Maybe at the time or others would be picking up a book to read. That's my time to actually just sit on the couch, maybe with a glass of wine, and just think. And so I'm thinking about connecting dots, thinking about the future of the world, what's wrong with it, where it's going. And after you spend time thinking about something at that level, then you have questions. And then you find people that would be good people to talk through those questions with. And then like a piece of clay, you start to mold it. And then you talk to more people and you mold it. And then eventually you form a point of view. And that's kind of how it starts. But I couldn't imagine doing that from reading, because it takes, 12 hours to read a book, and it's somebody's very specific, one person's opinion, and you get caught up in a lot of the details and weeds and things. It's hard to sometimes pull out of that. If I spent those 12 hours thinking, you could start at any level you want, the highest level, and work down, as opposed to just picking a book, which is typically a very specific topic that you spend 12 hours on. So I don't know. I mean, if that's the best approach for everyone, but it works for me.
And that's I'm glad you got the intention of the question, because once again, some people I think best through just like reading a book, and then it takes me way longer than 12 hours to read a book, because I spend a lot of time thinking about it. So once again, everyone has a different process there. So
yeah, everyone's got their own process.
So here's the big last question, which is basically this: as you're sitting and looking at this space, how do you prevent the process of thinking and considering and talking to experts from detracting from just doing the thing? Because, as we're discussing here, as we said, you do one thing and then another path opens up, so another path opens up. There's only so much questioning you can do. How are you thinking through the process here of when, and I'm not asking for a literal date on when you're starting and when you're building, but when do you think you're able to assess, okay, we're good. Okay, we've talked to this number of experts. Now it's time for us to start executing. You can only spend so much time on your pitch deck before you go. So I'd love to hear your answer to that.
Right. Yeah, no, that is the question, Marshall. So that's the last question to end on. That is probably one of the hardest parts of being an entrepreneur, is to know when to sort of let go and just say, we're good, let's go. I think I like to think about it as sort of like, building a house. You start with the foundation. The foundation needs to be really solid. And so spend a lot of time on mission and values and how we're going to live those values. And I think that's really sort of important. And then you start layering and building the house. And that's sort of your vision. Like, what do you want to become 10, 50, 100 years? What do you want this to become? And then the strategy is sort of like high level. What are the choices you're making to get and make that vision a reality? And spending a lot of time sort of on that piece of it. And then once you kind of have that in place, that's sort of the V and VCP. You start finding the very best people in the world to execute the different pieces of that vision. And once you feel like you've got the right people in the right spots, everyone's on board with the vision, you've got that nice foundation of mission and values, then you feel ready. Then you say go. And you basically just empower people and let it go. Can't control it at that point. And so I think, you can control the vision and mission up front because that's really the foundational. But if you try and control it beyond once you bring great people in and try to control it after that, I don't think you'll reach the intended result. People won't feel empowered. They won't give it the best they've got. They won't put their passion into it in the same way. And then just like you said before, if the city is expected to grow organically, you need all the people that are professionals in each of the areas to also organically let their areas evolve and grow the way they envision it. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's how I think about it.
It does. And if you'll pardon me, I lied. There's actually one more obvious question I should ask you. A lot of what you're saying is clearly influenced by your experience as a venture capitalist and as a founder. What is the one thing, or what is one thing you've had to discard from your personal experiences so far that you've had to discard to actually approach this challenge?
That's a great question. I don't think I have the answer to that yet because it's still early right now. We have been approaching it sort of as you would a startup. I know there's going to be a time where that's not going to be the case. Certainly you're thinking about the way a city is governed, and the government of a city is very different. It's a whole nother element that's very different. And at some point, this is not a startup. It is a city. It will have a government. It will have, and be structured in a very similar way to existing cities, with the exception of this private endowment foundation. But I can't answer that question. It's something that's on my mind you basically just need to be open to everything at this point. You can't have too much mapped out in your own head because things will evolve. And I think it's that adaptability that's really important at this stage, probably in every stage, just being open, adapting. And this is the thing that I think entrepreneurs have a really tough time with. You need to sell and be convicted about the vision. And at the same time, you need to be open to listening to every new piece of information that becomes available, because you have a certain strategy, vision based on information that you know. But as you get new information, you have to constantly rethink, is that the right strategy in lieu of this new information? A lot of people have a really hard time basically taking that information in and being open to say that, no, the strategy may be wrong. You don't want to ever change the mission and values. That should be your North Star. That should never change. That's the foundation. It's always going to be there. So you got to get that right. But vision and strategy can change with new information, and you have to be open to it. Marshall, one more thing I just want to add that we didn't really touch on, and I always get asked this question of is this a utopia? Is that the goal, is to create a utopia? Utopias historically in history have never worked. And we're very cognizant of that fact. This is not meant to be utopia, and this is certainly not meant to be the answer. All we're trying to do is, with a clean slate, take a shot. We have a hypothesis, take a shot, and we're going to try something. And at the very worst case, there are going to be things to learn. Whether it works, whether it doesn't work, there are going to be things to learn. And hopefully those learnings will inspire other people to take shots. And if more people take shots, there'll be enough things learned, something will eventually hit, and it will make the world a better place for future generations. That's sort of the goal here.
And that is the perfect place to end. Well, thank you so much for joining.
Thanks, Marshall.
Thanks for joining us in the deep end. If you enjoyed your stay, give us a review on Apple Podcasts and share this episode with your friends and colleagues to help grow the show with us. We've also got show notes and more episodes available at ideas.beyonddeck.com. See you next time.